this book. So I will hand over the floor to Leslie, and we're delighted that you can share your work with us this evening. So I understand we'll give you about a half hour to talk about it, and we'll...
Yeah, sounds good. And two other things. One, I put some flyers out there if you want to order the book. You get a slight discount if you use the flyer. And I would like to add one thing to Yves's curriculum, which is he just flew in from China today. He's already given a lecture, a big public lecture, and he still said yes to this event, so thank you very much for that. Okay, let's see. All right, so the Brics and Collective Financial Statecraft, as you heard, it's co-authored. The reason it's co-authored is it's a project of three of us who all have different regional specialties. Cynthia Roberts is a Russia specialist, and her previous work has been mostly in security politics. Saori is an East Asia specialist. She's more on the IP, the political economy side, and I'm a Brazilianist, but I've done a lot of work on India, and I picked up South Africa, so I'm the democracies hat of this project. 5 sections, the usual ones: background and definitions, the question, the evidence, country motivations, that is, of the 5 countries, and the conclusions. And the question, the core question is, do the Brics matter? Do we care that Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa have gotten together and formed an international club? Does it make any difference? And as a couple of people were saying to me, there's a lot of skepticism that it does matter. And not surprisingly, we conclude, there's a lot of skepticism of many of my colleagues. Whenever we go to some academic convention and we talk about the Brics, they say, well, it's all very nice, but let's talk about something important. And my contention is this is something important. Background and definitions. Little background to global governance. The industrial democracies dominate global governance. They lead. What institutions do we have that are important in global governance today? Basically, they are the ones established at the end of the Second World War, with in mind the idea that one of the causes of the Second World War was the fact that during the 20s and especially the 30s, during the Great Depression, there were lots of global problems that needed international cooperation that was not forthcoming. There was not successful global governance, either political or economic. After the Second World War, then, you have political institutions set up, the most important ones, the United Nations, and of course the Security Council within that, of which there are 5 members, US, Britain, France, USSR, China, and NATO. And then on the economic side, post-war economic governance, a trade organization which becomes now the WTO, the World Bank, the IMF. In the 70s, another global governance institution comes out that's less institutionalized, but very important in terms of its effect on how international economic and political problems are managed, and that would be the group of 7 advanced industrial countries. What about other countries? Emerging powers, or as my Russia colleague constantly was correcting the other 2 of us, or re-emerging powers. The Russians don't like emerging powers as a designation. Well, okay, Russia was invited to join the G7 after the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, and then it was uninvited in 2014 because of intervention in the Ukraine. The World Bank and IMF, the three democracies are all founding members. The People's Republic joins both, or takes Taiwan's seat in 1980. Russia doesn't join until 1992. I mean, after the transition, the Soviet Union was not a member. The WTO, their accession is relatively recent. China had to make a lot of changes in order to join in 2001. Russia just joined a couple of years ago. The G20, created at the end of the Asian financial crisis in 1999, when there was the recent global financial crisis from 2007 to 2009, the G20 group of, now it's called large countries, which includes the G7, all 5 of the Brics and a few other economies, was talked about as possibly replacing the G7 as an informal global governance management institution. This is important background. Let's start from here. It is interesting to note, so what we're doing here is we're looking at shares of various kinds of hard power capabilities calculated in 1995 and calculated in 2013. This chart is not actually in the book, it's from something else I did, but I think it's a good single chart to show the change. So the economy, for example, shows GDP, market rate GDP, which actually tends to understate the share of developing countries. And if you look at the bottom, what's the first thing that I think is interesting to note on this is that if you add together the share of the G7 and the Brics, it pretty much, it doesn't change a whole lot over this period. I mean, the share of the G7 plus the Brics is about 68%, it's about 62% in 2013. So there's a little difference, but not that much. In other words, in terms of this overall index, the index is just, we measured these things. You can ask me how. You can always argue about the measurements, and then we just took them, we weighted them equally and divided by 5. The other thing to notice, and I understand this is very rough and ready, but the other thing to notice is that there is some redistribution within this group. So the first point is there's not a lot of redistribution if you add all of these together. But the US share falls a little bit. The share of the G7 as a whole falls quite a bit. Similarly, China's share grows a lot, and the share of the Brics grows somewhat. Basically, China's growth accounts for about half. So the first thing I say to people who say the Brics don't matter is, well, did you know that there's been this kind of a shift in these hard power capabilities? You probably have heard it was initially Brics with a small s, and then it becomes Brics with a big S when South Africa is added. There were some previous interactions among these countries. I'm not going to go through it. I think what is interesting is, I will note under the second header that it's a Russian idea, initiated in 2006, that when the global financial crisis is occurring, I wrote fall 2009, it should be fall 2008. Okay, so make that correction in your mind. In 2007, there's a US subprime mortgage crisis. It becomes a global financial crisis after Lehman Brothers fails, and this all of a sudden throws banks all over the world into panic, leading to the first summit, that is, meeting of actual country leaders of the G7, or the G20 countries, at which point the BRICS become more important. They become important actors within that summit. They participate in the coordinated global stimulus that major countries around the world activate. All right. Here's a few pictures. This is the first summit. Manmohan Singh, Medvedev, Hu Jintao, and Lula. And here, all the leaders have changed, but it's still going on, which is some indication of institutionalization. All the leaders have changed except Manmohan Singh, and here's the most recent one. In this one, they're all different from the initial summit. Okay. All right, so I've defined BRICS. We're on background and definition still. What do we mean by financial statecraft? We means Leslie and her two co-authors. We define it as the use by states of financial and monetary levers that the states can control, either directly or kind of indirectly through their regulatory authority, of financial and monetary levers to achieve their larger foreign policy goals. In other words, using financial regulation of various kinds or direct financial transfers for foreign policy ends. Traditionally, the term financial statecraft has had a much more limited meaning. I mean, it has existed in the literature, but when you say that, most people think you're talking about, and most of the things that are written, you think you're talking about the use by great powers vis-a-vis small powers and sanctioning them. Done. Something like the Financial Action Task Force, that's FATF. This is a rogue state, we're going to freeze their citizens' bank accounts until they shape up. We expand the definition of financial statecraft in the following way. So traditional view then, the agent, that is the actor, is an individual state. The target is an individual state. The means is coercion. I mean, it's understood as punishment and coercion. The understanding of interstate power is you're trying to influence. A is trying to get B, A is the actor, to act in some way that B otherwise wouldn't act. And agent, again, it's typically understood as something major powers alone can do. In fact, we have a lovely quote in the book from two eminent scholars who calculate that you can't engage in financial statecraft unless you are at least 10 times more powerful than your target. We say, well, we could think about this more broadly. And we could say a group of states may engage in financial statecraft. And clearly, sometimes advanced industrial countries do that too. If you put sanctions on Russia or Iran, that is collective. A group of states could be the target, or some social institution at the international level could be the target, or market, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The means includes offense in the sense of action by means not just of coercion, but by means of inducement. We're trying to get you could say assertion instead of offense. We're trying to get you to do something. We'll pay you to vote with us at the UN. We'll give you foreign aid in return. That's financial statecraft, or persuasion, and also defense. Trying to resist financial statecraft. Understanding of power can include also autonomy and structural power in social institutions. Constituting new norms, new intersubjective realities. And finally, of course, we are arguing that you don't have to be a major power. You can be a middle power. So the research questions then are, one, do the BRICS matter? That's a big one. We also address from time to time the second question, does the activity of the BRICS pose a fundamental challenge to the liberal internationalist order? Which is something that people worry about. So the analytical task then is, how do you think about this? There are many, many multilateral clubs. So how do you know when they matter? How do we know? And, you know, analytically, we're trying to, we have to show, if we want to argue that they matter, we have to show that somehow global institutions or markets were bumped off their previous trajectories, and that somehow this group acting jointly was important in contributing to that bumping. That it wasn't just, for example, China. Because that we've gotten that response, oh, it's just China. And we don't think that's the case. So a little more here, I'm not going to go into this much. So we're engaged in a counterfactual thought experiment. You know, we know this happened. Well, we can imagine that had this not happened, it would have gone like this. Did the Brics alter the course of events? Has their joint international behavior been within norms? I kind of touched on all that, and I would note that in order to answer the do they matter question affirmatively, you know, we don't have to show that the Brics have achieved every single goal they set out. And we also don't have to show that they keep going in the future, just for the record. Our evidence. We have 4 cases. We look at collective financial statecraft. What does that say, 15? Okay, 1-5. Yeah, all right. We look at collective financial statecraft in, you know, social scientists love 4x4 tables, right? So we divide actions between what we call inside reforms and outside options. This language is not original with us. Inside reforms is you work within existing global governance institutions and you try to get more space for influence. Outside options, you say, all right, fine, we'll start our own. We'll try to do it on our own. That's the basic division. And then we have another dimension, working within institutions. That would be mostly organizations and mostly formal, but not so formal. Like the G7 is actually not all that formal, and similarly the G20. And in markets. So then our fourfold table here. Inside reforms of institutions, the Brics have acted to pursue greater influence in the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and World Bank. Inside reforms of markets, within the existing market structure, within the existing distribution of market power in global finance, currency, credit, etc., try to prevent the West from using it for financial statecraft. Outside options create new institutions controlled by the Brics. And outside options for markets try to actually use intentional political cooperation to shift markets, to shift the market reality. Just a minute. So, quick rundown. Case 1, the goal would be greater influence in the IMF and World Bank, and the 2 big chapters are one on these 4 cases. In the book has 5 chapters, and then the other one on why they cooperated. So this one, they joined the chairs and shares debate. That refers to how many voting shares you have in the World Bank and IMF, which is determined by your quotas, which means how much you contribute, but it's basically how much you're allowed to contribute. And that's the shares, and the chairs is if you contribute more than X, you have your own executive director on the board of directors. And we have lots of details in there. They also tried to cooperate to denounce the previous, never really publicly debated tradition whereby the head of the IMF would always be a European and the head of the World Bank would always be an American. Results. Well, after much bargaining, the quotas for the Brics countries are a little bit bigger. And they were able to hang together quite well. In fact, they even bargained within the G20 in 2009 when they were most needed. They said, well, yeah, we'll contribute to giving more money to the IMF to bail out countries that need it, mostly in Europe. But we want some kind of quid pro quo. And it took a while, but they did get something. They were not able, interestingly, to coordinate around pushing common nominees for either the World Bank or the IMF. Inside reforms of markets, this is, as I said, in essence, preventing the status quo powers from using their financial power for political ends. And our case here is the sanctions against Russia for intervention in the Ukraine. And interestingly enough, the other four are not, they were very careful to say, well, we don't actually support what Russia's doing, but we don't like the idea that other countries should put pressure on Russia. So they lined up very nicely in those who were on the Security Council for part of the time and so on, and sort of making statements. We don't think that countries that happen to have financial power should be able to use it to pursue their political agenda. The result was it was certainly a clear benefit to Russia. Outside option of creating institutions, this is one that has gotten a lot of interest. The Brics created two institutions, the New Development Bank and a contingent reserves arrangement. The New Development Bank is actually up and running. And we have quite a bit of interesting stuff about the intra-Brics bargaining. All of the larger Brics wanted to host it, but China said, sorry, we're hosting it. And China wanted to have a bigger quota, but the other said, no, we're not going to do it unless you give us the same quota and therefore the same vote. So, okay, it's housed in China, but they each contributed $10 billion. And it's lending, it lends in Brics currencies, which is interesting. The contingent reserve arrangement, which is essentially an IMF type institution, is still in the planning stages. I will note that right when the New Development Bank was being created, China announced, oh, and we're creating this other new institution, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Russia in particular was, sort of voce furious, but China's going to do what China wants to do. All of the other Brics, however, joined as founding members. So, for example, Brazil is the only founding member from the Western Hemisphere. Reasonable success. Got quite a lot of attention in the global financial press, and the NDB has already issued its first bond to raise money in the markets. And finally, the outside option of reshaping markets. This is a very clear indicator of the fact that the Brics have cooperated in the sense they've been willing to pay some costs to hang together. We look at their efforts to promote the internationalization, that is, the greater use in international markets of the Chinese currency, the renminbi. That would include, as reserve currency or for trade invoicing, for swap arrangements. It's not clear that there are a lot of economic benefits for the other four. For example, they all complain about the US dollar, but since the renminbis track the US dollar pretty closely, it's not clear they'd be a lot better off with more renminbi use. But they still have made lots of statements. So they're willing at least to go some distance verbally. And this has had some concrete results, arguably partly because of Brics pressure. At the end of 2016, IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde announced that the renminbi would join the basket of currencies composing the IMF's quasi-currency, the SDR, the special drawing rights. That means there are only 4 currencies in it, the dollar, the euro, the yen, and the pound. So this is actually a big deal. And moreover, it would join at a 10% of the basket level. So it's a clear political win for China. Sorry, wrong direction. So in general, then, we conclude that in all of these 4 cases, there was quite a bit of cooperation, and it did make some difference. The short version here, as I said, we have a big, long chapter where we go through it country by country. Why? Why do they do this? These are 4 countries from different parts of the world. There are 2 authoritarian regimes and 3 democracies. They don't even trade that much with one another, many of them. So why? We basically, the one division is China and everybody else, because China is the biggest. We say China's major motivation has probably been to mask its rise, to make itself look less threatening. Well, it's not us. It's the Brics. It's emerging powers around the world who want to challenge the status quo, advanced industrial countries. And for the other 4, it's relations with China. It's, benefit from China's rapid growth and rise. We are the club of fast-growing countries, whether or not Brazil has been or Russia has been in recent years. But, plus they all are getting investment, in some cases loans from China, and in general, to bind China to themselves. That we say, bottom line, simple 25 words or less reason, that's what's going on. I would note, in terms of the group, probably in the medium run, the most problematic relationship within the group is the China-India one. Conclusions. So, yeah, we think they matter. We note that fortuitously for the Brics Club, they were relatively well-placed to benefit from the embarrassment of the United States and other Western major powers of the global financial crisis of 2007, 2009. And there was a certain amount of crowing in major emerging markets. Obviously, the Washington consensus is imperfect, at the very least. China and the other 4, we argue, have in fact successfully used one another for some global status increments and some concrete economic benefits. Russia, I note, thinking about going forward, which is the most status aggrieved among the 5, is probably the most committed to the Brics in the future. At least this is my personal opinion. And Russia's been paying all along, has been paying probably a disproportionate share of the costs in terms of allocating resources to Brics research on this, to Brics websites, to Brics this and that. Thus far, the Brics have mostly respected the norms of global financial governance. This is the question, if the Brics become more powerful within the existing global governance institutions, should we panic? Well, we don't actually answer that, but we say, so far, they've mostly respected norms. In fact, I would note that, as you may have been aware, the U.S. president has been very, very skeptical and very critical of global economic governance institutions, such as, the OECD and also at Davos, the World Economic Forum. The most recent one, of course, it was Xi Jinping that was making all the statements, we need free trade. And the Europeans were furious at President Trump for making them dial back on the OECD meeting statement about trade. So the final conclusion then, the BRICS value the liberal world economy probably more than liberal internationalist politics. All right, that is what I have to say. Why don't you go, they're actually videotaping it so they can see you that way.
So hello everyone. I won't use the PowerPoint. I'll just bring a few points first about the books and then raise some questions. And after giving some compliments. So I actually want to start with compliments. And I should preface this by saying I've been actually involved quite a bit with the BRICS. And this year I was invited to the think tank meetings in China, preparing the Xiamen Summit. So I've been really inside the BRICS machinery. There are very few non-BRICS scholars actually invited. And so from that perspective, and from perspective of having followed the BRICS literature for 10 years, this is probably the best book that I have seen so far. Not just from what you have seen, but it's also a very analytical, high-quality book, going through extremely tight work on definitions, conceptualization, tables, etc., and well put within the IR literature. It's also a very neatly crafted, after doing all the theory and conceptualization, going down to one particular lens and a set of cases and a very neat methodology. So our first thing is to congratulate the authors. This is not easy on a topic like the BRICS that's so diffuse and so fast-moving and with so much literature floating around. It's also not easy when you have 3 authors and 5 very difficult countries that are all moving and all complex. So I'll first mention a couple strengths, and then I'll raise a few questions and a couple minor disagreements that I have. The first one is the question is very important, and I agree with the book and with Leslie. The question of BRICS impact on global financial governance and why is important. This has floated around now for years, but is never really handled fully analytically, etc. To state it simply, the BRICS is a group that should not exist. I mean, it's a creation of Jim O'Neill, an investment banker, 2001, in terms of one issued 4 countries. And it combines a re-emerging, declining old power, Russia, with the fastest rising power, China, with a very delicate, troubled democracy, Brazil, that rose and then collapsed, and an emerging transition democracy, South Africa, with as well India, which is another fast-rising economic democracy. So it's an interesting group. I mean, if we wanted to create a group of emerging powers, we may not put Russia in it. We would put Indonesia, Mexico, Turkey, in fact, other G20 emerging powers. So it's a very odd group. When many scholars of IP saw it first, it's like, oh, they're very clever branding. Maybe Russia's clever in 2009, but it makes no sense. It will go nowhere. And it sticks around, right? It's actually amazing. They keep meeting, and they institutionalize themselves. And to just give you one example, the Xiamen Summit, they do like the G20, becomes an iceberg. So the summit is the tip, but what's under the entire machinery of institutionalization, in the Xiamen Summit, there was, apart from a declaration which is very long, there were 3 documents on political and security cooperation, 40 documents on economic cooperation and 4 agreements, 20 documents on people-to-people exchanges, including traditional medicine, youth, art, theater, and 2 MOUs, total 69 agreements, Before the Xiamen, this year alone, Xiamen Summit, there were 23 meetings at ministerial levels. So ministers meeting before, 23 times. 37 at senior official level. 18 people-to-people meetings, including 3 major think tank summits, the one of which I attended, and 16 other summits, which makes 94 senior meetings, culminating into the Xiamen Summit. So this is an example of institutionalization. It's getting legs, where something that shouldn't make sense is getting legs and is being institutionalized. They are developing further topics for their work together, looking forward. Ocean, tourism, space, you're going to see them very active in space. PPP, private-public partnerships. Energy, culture, regionalization, aviation, customs. And there's a lot now on cyberspace governance. So I was struck in my own summit how much there was convergence and work being developed on cyber governance. So the second point I wanted to make, so this is the best conceptualization of the Brics as an entity that I have seen as a club. Very good points, for example, on the idea of common aversions, which allowed them to overcome the democracy-authoritarian divide, cleavage. Very nice table, which is not in the presentation today, but page 21 on the typology of Brics club policies, with the issue of bargaining power, status, and group interests. And a very balanced analytical conclusion. So all those things make the book a high-quality book. The lens of collective financial statecraft as one piece of the whole universe of Brics is clever. It's also the one that was the first to come out. And the 4 cases, again, as you saw, neatly thought together with the 2x2 table, which indeed political economy scholars love. The data on those cases is thorough in all the, in the rest of the book. So those are all wonderful reasons why all of you should read the books. Now I'm getting to a few questions and a couple of disagreements. The big question, so the whole conceptualization, everything is great. But when we get to the impact and the actual final measurements, if we wanted to typologize the measurements, if we want to grade the impact, that's where there's a little bit of a few leaps going on. First on cases, and second on the role of China. So I find a bit of weakness on the China side. For example, the major case of success, that is to be pushing the IMF quota reforms. I have been quite involved in this 2010 G20 summit and the summit in Gyeongju 2 weeks before, where decisions were made. And the way the decisions were made in that summit in Korea, in fact, showcased, number one, the absolutely proactive role of Dominique Strauss-Kahn. So the head of the IMF was the one who concocted a plan with Lee Myung-bak, so Lee Myung-bak, the president of South Korea, in forcing the US and others to accept the reforms. So the Brics were not alone. In fact, alone they probably would not have gotten it. The IMF itself was hyperactive in a very entrepreneurial way, with Strauss-Kahn, who personally believed in it. And Korea, as the host, was super important. So it's a non-Brics component. So if we really unpack how that quota reform happened, it's more complex than just a Brics story. The Brics are just a catalyst. And going beyond, have been spending my last 10 years actually at every G20 summit and unpacking the G20. What's fascinating is the G20 is often a confrontation between EU, Europe, continental Europe. The UK has bailed out after Gordon Brown initially was on the EU side, and then the UK afterwards pulled out, against the US, often US with Japan, Canada, and a few other allies. And the Brics are often median players, but more often than not, they cooperate with Europe. So France, Germany, and Brics have often acted together. And without the role of France and Germany, who often are much harsher than the Brics in pushing for reforms, we often forget that, for example, the reform of the dollar-based international monetary system was first of all pushed by Sarkozy, by France, right? And the Brics were much more cautious. It's like, we don't want to go this far, not now. They Sarkozy convinced China to host a Nanjing summit on the future of the monetary system. China really didn't want to do it. So that's why they pushed it down to Nanjing, not to Beijing, et cetera, et cetera. And because of caution, they knew it was too confrontational with the US, it would lead to a bad outcome. Tobin tax. Brazil was very hot on this. India was sympathetic. South Africa was good. But the pusher was Sarkozy, was France, right, against the US. And China was ambivalent, was refusing to side with France. So the BRICS kind of really medium players there, but a lot of the battles in the G20 were not between BRICS and G7. They were between Europe and US. And the BRICS playing very closely with the Europeans. And it's that balance that allowed then the Europeans to back up the AIIB very quickly. So we have an increasing new axis between Europeans and China and others on many, many issues. Something else under RMBUs, again, the SDR story has a very heavy action by many other players, and it includes even the US. So there was a high-stake compromise between US and China over this as part of the Obama engagement with China, and we know the inside story. I've interviewed the NSC director of the Obama, and so there was clearly a US will to engage on this issue as part of a great bargain with China, and the Europeans were supportive. So it's not just a simple BRIC story. On the RMBUs, we both followers of Jerry Cohen. We know Jerry Cohen is a great skeptic on this, and he often repeats the RMBUs has peaked in 2015, it's going down now. So it's not another success, right? I mean, it's not been helpful. The dollar system is so entrenched that they're only touching the surface here. So on those outcomes, I think this is where the book goes a little too far in making the case for those outcomes where there's so many other variables and other players that kind of played with them. Even though they did play, they may have been the initial first movers, they may have been the agenda setters, but they couldn't on their own carry the outcome without stronger allies there. And so the ally component may be very, very important as well. Second, on the BRICS of China, and AIIB versus NDB and versus BRI, right? So far we haven't talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is bigger than anything the BRICS are doing. Today it's the biggest initiative in the global economy on Earth, right? The scale dwarfs anything else we're seeing. And that's purely China-led, but with a lot of cooperation with all the BRICS countries correctly. But one data, just to give my own data point here, so in nominal dollar, the BRICS in 2000 were 8%, 2015, 23% of global economy moving forward. In PPP term, they're now 30%. But the China share of growth between 20 and 2016 is 87% of the increase. So I'm not going back to 95 here, I'm looking at the more recent years, and of course that makes the effect. So especially 2013 to 2017 is almost entirely China and India, and Brazil is negative. And so the China weight is bigger, even in current years, than it was at the beginning. 87 on the current growth, 87% of current growth. What motivates China? I'm spending my whole time now writing this set of article books on China versus global governance. I find, after years of interviews, etc., that it's more complex than a simple mask its rise. I find, looking at many dimensions of what it does on climate, on finance, on trade, etc., there's a very strong exit and voice, tactical action, reaction role, and there's a lot of forum shopping behavior. So clearly China is looking at all the tools they have, Shanghai Cooperation, BRICS is one, G20, et cetera, all kind of bilateral tools, and engagement with Eastern Europe and summit and all kind of stuff. And they push different forum at different moments for different reasons. And so the BRICS is one component of a larger strategy to advance its national interests, to establish, the ultimate goal is the China dream, to continue the modernization of China and make it secure in the international system by trying to find a way to defuse the US. The US being the only power able to stop them. And so sometimes they use the G20. 2016, it was all about G20. 2017, it was all about BRICS, because they were hosting Xiamen. So when we look at the situation in 2017, China is maybe 100 times more committed to BRICS than Russia. And is investing the number of think tank meetings, the number of BRICS centers in every university in China, the number of action probably dwarfs China 10 times over. So that's one of my little quiver here with these agreements. In China, by the way, most scholars think that Russia is not committed to BRICS. When you talk to all the BRICS scholars in China, they think Russia is very realist, very tactical, and instrumental. They never have an institutional commitment to BRICS. It's purely a tool to stop the constraints coming from the US. But whenever they can have another way, then they will drop the BRICS. That's the Chinese perspective. So the Chinese perspective is that the more committed partners are actually South Africa and Brazil that have a deep belief in it. It's kind of a philosophical belief. Russia is a realist old power. And China, they feel the Chinese are more committed than the Russians. That's what the Chinese feel. But they are part of a portfolio approach, a very broad portfolio approach, so many tools. And India is the least committed, they think. So India is the one blocking any enlargement to other countries. India is very skeptic because they're always much more inward in their foreign policy. That's what you hear in China. And BRI now, the Belt and Road today in 2018 dwarfs everything else that China does. And so BRICS will become now a subcomponent of Belt and Road. Belt and Road is the only priority that's entrenched in the constitution of the Communist Party since the 19th Party Congress. Nothing else is in there. No BRICS is in the constitution. And this is where Xi Jinping personally has put his mark. So the Belt and Road will test going forward the BRICS. On the NDB, we can actually get all the data of all the projects, and it's done pretty good, to about $2 to $3 billion a year in the last 2 years, balanced among the countries. But there have been a couple of weird projects. One failure in South Africa with the ESCOM project that's canceled due to massive corruption. And the Russian one, there is 400 to 500 million going to the Supreme Court of Russia to kind of build the legal system in Russia, which really looks, when you unpack the thing, it looks like, are you here to pay the bureaucrats in Russia, or is it just a boondoggle? So whereas everywhere else in China, India, Brazil, they have gone toward clean energy and a pretty nice quality set of projects. So, but there's 2 question marks on the projects that I have unpacked. NDB versus AIB, the inside story, again interviewing the insiders in China, is that the cost was so great for China, it was so frustrating with India. India has really exhausted the Chinese and infuriated them in those negotiations that they couldn't stand it anymore, and most of their heart has gone to AIB afterwards. That India is an impossible bargain, they're going too far. That's the Chinese view, right? And actually, ironically, the AIB is on better grounds because they have so many OECD countries that they have a very high rating and they're able to raise money, and they have stronger capital anyway and able to raise much more money, whereas the NDB has a hard time with its rating and therefore its fundraising. I talked with the vice president of the NDB last year, and he explained how difficult it is, that they were hoping to be the cockpit for new thinking, new approach to development, but they're so constrained by the need to raise money because they have too little capital, in part because they did not allow China to put more than 10 billion. So the political constraint has been such that the power of the NDB is very, very small. The AIB has had much more space and freedom in contrast to operate. Question mark on the China-India relation. What we know is there have been very bitter fights over the NDB, over the IMF selection, over BRI, strong disagreement over Belt and Road Initiative, and over renminbi. And the whole BRICS summit nearly collapsed in Xiamen because of the dispute between China and India and the Doklam Plateau, which from interviews I've done with the top level seems to have been a case where actually there was no good civilian control of the military. So it looks like the PLA made its move without the authorization of Xi Jinping, and in fact infuriated Xi Jinping, who does put importance to the BRICS. So then it took 2 months to kind of resolve it, and without losing too much face for Xi Jinping, and save the BRICS summit, but it nearly died, right? So that reminds us how tense that China-India relation is at the core of the BRICS. And by the way, they only could resolve it by firing the chief of staff of the PLA and the number 6 below, So the two key commanders that made the decision on Doklam had to be fired before Xi Jinping was able to solve the Doklam crisis and then host the Brics Summit. So it was a close call. We shouldn't remember that. Finally, one thought when I was sitting through all those summits in China and parsing out the Xiamen Summit, I was thinking, well, the financial statecraft, I remain a little more mitigated on the final outcomes. I mean, they did get some stuff only because of the other coalitions coming together. Other things they're not getting, or the NDB, I think, is a mixed. Gradually, it may take off, but it will take a long time. But what I'm observing is they have so many other dimensions that are now being institutionalized. You know, what I mentioned earlier, cyber, ocean, traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge. So many things are being institutionalized, and so many groups of students are now traveling to each other's countries. There's funding, there are grants, there's so much that is developing out of the Brics that maybe it's that creation of new discourses, the creation of new people-to-people networks, new relationships, and new lower layers that will have an eventual big impact on the future of international relations. So there's a lot to see, just like all those agreements coming out of the summits. There is actually quite a bit that will have more and more impact beyond just the financial statecraft. I also wanted to conclude by thinking that the Brics lens, in fact, is almost a mirror image of the international system, or the health of the international system. The Brics are able to claim a moral high ground where, in fact, the liberal international order is failing, or where we are hypocritical, where it's not fulfilling its function. For example, if we have a fair, rule-based liberal international order, well, indeed, we should adjust the IMF and World Bank votes according to GDP. That's what the system, a fair, rule-based system should do. And it's when the US doesn't allow it for crass political reasons that then there is this moral high ground that's opened up for the Brics. So wherever the Brics have had a strong voice, have marked points, is actually a mirror image or something that reveals weaknesses in our international system. What's also fascinating is contrasting, as Leslie did, the Trump discourse and all the set of actions and the horrible G20 we had in Berlin in terms of Trump management with the Xiamen Summit. And we find that the communique of the Xiamen Summit, they actually follow all the international norms. They want, all those things on security, including on North Korea and on Syria, etc. They want to have a rule-based trade system. They have a rule-based investment system. In fact, the declaration is closer to a liberal international order in absolute or philosophical terms than the reality coming out of Trump. So it's actually pretty fascinating, and it's an action-reaction way. So the more the US is abdicating its leadership role, the more there is indeed space for the Brics, and the space is bigger when they work with the Europeans in particular. So I'll leave it there, but congratulations for amazing book.
Well, just to echo what Yves said about how much I enjoyed reading the book, you invited us and gave us the books before the holiday, so it came with me on my beach holiday, which, if you want to pass the time doing some beach reading, I highly recommend reading this. Very light, don't have to think too hard. No, I'm just kidding. I really, I got a lot of this book for a number of the reasons that Yves said, and I just thought it was really high quality, brought a ton of really diverse, both theoretical lenses, IPE, emerging market, and then just data and narrative together in a way that I was initially a skeptic, and I can share that with here. When I was teaching about emerging markets, not when the Brics were started, I wasn't quite out of grad school yet, but in 2005, when the idea was out there, I thought it was the most ridiculous thing that the business world had concocted that had no basis in reality. Just pick a few countries that are going to grow quickly. And then, but Brics was successful. It kind of caught on, and then the Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and Citigroup economists started coming up with these other groups of countries They had missed Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey, but they haven't put a bank together. There was the next 11 of Bangladesh, Egypt, Indonesia, India, Iran, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, Philippines, Turkey, South Korea, and Vietnam. They don't have a standing army together, so that's some evidence that Brics has more legs. Pigs, the sort of failures of the European financial crisis, don't have a caucus on the sidelines of the G20. I don't think Greece probably goes to that one, or Ireland. So, and this book just brings forward a compelling case that Brics might have been concocted by Goldman Sachs, but it's got legs. And let me come back to that at the very end and why that might be the case. I have a paper with Paul Novosad at Dartmouth that just came out in the Review of International Organizations, where we didn't look at the formal rules, but we were looking at the informal outcome of staffing the United Nations Secretariat. And the idea here was that there's a struggle between countries to get, just like we learned about in the World Bank and the IMF, to get your nationals in high positions to run the global system. Now, this isn't finance, but it's politics. And what we found was that small European democracies have a way overweight presence in the UN Secretariat, and they have since the founding of the organization. And what this chart shows is the share of these top seats for Western Europe and the offshoots, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, as compared to their share of global population. Now, GDP would look even, well, maybe not so early, but it would look steeper there. And so there's just been a strong hold that these countries, in particular the Europeans, have had over control of the Secretariat. Whereas if you look at the Brics, and certainly Indonesia and the other high population developing countries, they have almost nothing. And that's, of course, begun to change, but our data ran out in 2009. And so reading Leslie's book, just particularly the influence of the Europeans in resisting their shares going to the BRIC countries really drove home. Now, let me just propose a slight wrinkle in the spirit of discussion, which when I see inside reform and outside options, I'm thinking from a bargaining perspective, where part of your goal for doing outside options is to increase your ability to negotiate on the inside. We're prepared to walk, in other words, and that comes across in the book. Well, what if they're not just pursuing these options, but they're pursuing a better set of outcomes? Now, the Western institutions that are governing the world now are about 70 years old. And as we know about institutions, they start to develop special interests and barnacles, and they don't function as well. If we go back to foreign aid after World War II, we had the Marshall Plan. That was this very, pragmatic attempt to bring Western Europe out of the war. And then if you follow it to the 60s and 70s, even the introduction of the Peace Corps, it was very much to fight the Cold War. But now we have these special interests, including things like NGOs, that actually believe that aid not only is now, but always has been about reducing poverty. Crazy ideas. And then you've got the Beltway bandits, or the for-profit companies that live off contracts from the bilateral donors. And so when you want to change from a project-based approach, where the donor knows best, you get a ton of resistance from these guys, and they're just lobbying. They're congressional representatives, or not just representatives, but they're lobbying very hard to prevent that from happening. One of my early jobs was working with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which was a new U.S. agency to do foreign aid. And USAID's clients, the Beltway bandits, were the main lobbying force to prevent this new organization from starting that was going to do much more large projects, working with governments, and not necessarily going through them. So if you're going to start fresh, thinking about international institutions, what would you do? Now, from my business school hat, I want to suggest that not necessarily financial statecraft would be the key mode with which they were operating with the global system, but financial entrepreneurship. So basic strategy is you do your internal strategy, which is you look at the resources and capabilities of the firm, and you try to match it to opportunities. And then you do your external strategy. You look at the market and the competition. So let's say I'm thinking about the global system, and I'm the Brics. And first I'm going to think about internal strategy. Well, what capabilities do I have? And what what resources can I bring? Should I be engaged in foreign aid? Well, they do that, but they still have hundreds of millions of poor people, so that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. Should they be humanitarian saviors? They still have earthquakes where far too many people die, or droughts or poor irrigation or so on, so they're not that good at that. What about defense? Should they form an army together? Well, the problem there is that global borders have basically been set for decades, and there's very little to challenge it. That's one of the reasons why we think African states are so weak. So if your borders aren't challenged, security gets much more subtle. So what do they have? They have foreign exchange, in part because of their, trying to build up a buttress after the financial crisis, and in part to keep, likely, exports competitive. And once you get 3 trillion of it, what do you do with that? What do they need? They need continual development of markets and potentially access to resources to feed the supply chain. So how can you get that? So we sort of arrive at finance-based instruments as aligning with the resources, capabilities, and needs of these rising emerging market powers. And then on the external side, and I think both Leslie and Eve talked about this in their remarks, when you look at the international system, it's not that competitive, right? There's basically one play, the global system, and there's differences, of course, the Americans and the Europeans, and I didn't know about half the stuff that you were talking about. That's really fascinating. But there's more or less a cartel, the OECD world, and then the rules of the game that they put out. That leaves a lot of competitive space. And in strategy, we talk about a blue ocean, about going to the parts of the competitive space where nobody's at and delivering a new value proposition. And so that suggests that what they might do is not necessarily what they would do in a world in which they were the only player in a global system, but they're responding to what is already out there. So that means, if values is the game being done by OECD, and they're all about, we probably personify that the most these days. Canada's taking that to the extreme right now. Then you can talk about sovereignty, because it leaves this gap, and nobody's pushing sovereignty, so that presents an opportunity. Just like when we think about WhatsApp, when they came out, they were responding to text messages that were owned by the carriers, and they could charge people a lot of money for each time they sent or received a text. And so their strategy here was not to reinvent the text message, it was to do that in a world in which telecom carriers basically had a monopoly on this way to communicate, and they could do it on the data side much faster and cheaper, and in so doing, they responded to who was already there. Now, it's amazing what you can find with Google images in 12 seconds. So there's also this possibility, and I love how much both of you discussed how playing by the rules, in a sense, China and Russia and India and Brazil are doing. And some of that might come from their natural interests. As they're getting richer, with a couple exceptions recently, as their life expectancies are closing in on the rich countries, the education levels, tertiary education, we all know that now we could go to work in any number of universities in many emerging market countries. R&D levels, the global R&D machine is not just in rich countries now, it's widely distributed across knowledge centers globally. And even negative things like gender gap. We just saw an interesting paper where China's gender gap is growing as the state-owned enterprises are shutting down. And crime, so maybe we're all kind of becoming alike in terms of our economies as countries get richer and as they abandon some of the cultural things that might have set them apart, or the political institutions that don't have a lot of runway when you have a system of market capitalism. So that's with the emerging market side. And then for the rich countries, you've got this sort of backward bend or the reverse to the Trump world, or the rise of populism amongst European democracies, where political parties there that represent these much more inward-looking nativist interests are emerging. And so in a sense, there's some convergence there as well that matches some of the nationalism that we've seen out of China or Russia or Brazil over the last number of years. And another trend is the end of aid. So if you look at global poverty levels, they're falling. And on top of that, so there's fewer countries that you really need to help anymore. You've got fiscal strains amongst the OECD. They all borrowed, to pretty much the end of their debt sustainability during the global financial crisis. And then, of course, the changing values in these countries. So we're seeing a pullback of some of the institutions that might have separated rich countries from the middle-income countries. And so even we're seeing rich countries, they're saying, what should we do about this? Well, the answer is often we need more development finance, because then we can leverage markets and deploy less capital. So they're turning to development finance and more self-interest, focusing about immigration instead of helping others. So in a sense, there's this emergence of the Chinese model. Or this possibility that maybe the rise of the Brics and middle-income countries could reverse the reversal of fortune that began 500 years ago. So I love great power theory in part because I don't have to do too much in it. But they're obsessed with relative power, right, and relative standing and supremacy. And the idea is that if, and it's articulated so cleanly in the book that is, part of what we're all worried about is China rising and how we're going to do that in a peaceful way. So 500 years ago, China and other countries in the East had much more sophisticated economies and produced a greater variety of things in the West, but then that changed a while ago. But now we have this ironic moment that both Eve and Leslie mentioned, which is that the new champions of open trade are the Brics and other middle-income countries. And so there's this possibility that maybe they're going to kind of continue on this, the pullback of the West, with the exception of Europe, until their populist parties win, to hasten the global shift from the United States to China. But I think what comes across in this book really cleanly is that a multipolar world that people are worried about from a conflict perspective might just mean a world with more institutional heterogeneity. In other words, there will be different sets of institutions or forums that will exist there. And what might that mean for us? Well, in the absence of a monopoly on a sort of a single set of values driving what your options are to collaborate or compete against other countries in the international system, is we could see a faster convergence of outcomes. As you can forum shop, as Eve said, in order to get the outcome that best serves your national interests. And I think Leslie's book here gives us the data and argument to see that these emerging market rising powers are exercising inside and outside strategies to recalibrate global institutions and markets to reflect their new heft, and that's emerging through this combination of inside and outside plays. And then going back to the first comment, that they were chosen because of their economic characteristics. And I think the book is clear that they're not winning hearts and minds necessarily, but they're entering into contracts. So why might that be interesting? Well, if the very characteristics that brought them together were their economic characteristics, then why would it be surprising, perhaps, that they're operating mostly in the economic sphere? But then, if what they're doing is entering into contracts together, then that's actually creating greater stability in the world as opposed to introducing more uncertainty into it. And I think we should sort of feel comfortable with that from a fear of the rise perspective. And then Brics are operating as a coordinating institution to align the global interests there. And this notion that the first projects that the National Development Bank lended to were renewable energy projects, I think is the greatest proof that this isn't a revolutionary exercise. I think the Canadians would be delighted that there would be lending to solar power projects. So I'll stop there. Thanks very much again.
audience. Thank you both so much. Quick response to Eve's. Well, yes, of course, they're not the only game in town. And of course, this is clearly a case of which part of the elephant you're looking at. So we were looking at the Brics, and of course, even my presentation would probably be different if one of my co-authors had given it, because I'm looking at the democratic Brics. It looks a lot different from India, by the way. So yes, I thank you, and it all makes sense. Eric, it's so fascinating. One of the things I like about being in an interdisciplinary unit myself is you get these different perspectives. So I appreciated the business school kind of entrepreneurial. Let's look for the blue ocean and find where we can build up institutions. At the end, it almost sounded like you were making a version of what in international relations we talk about it. There are those who focus on states, and then there are those who say, no, states, okay, states. But really, a lot of what's happening is sub-state. That also comes out in your remarks, and networks, and so dense networks of multipolarity, and so fascinating. I will read your PowerPoint, and I also, before I sit down again for a moment, I want to correct one thing. I kept saying the OECD. Every time I said OECD, I probably meant G20. All right. So you want to run this, or?
Sure.
Yeah.
You can sit down though.
Yeah.
Or-
I'll stand up again.
Do you want the three of you to swing around and then we have an open discussion?
Oh, thank you. Why don't we just collect a couple of questions,
Okay.
and then
Questions?
whoever, anybody can answer. Well, you guys want to, now it's open season, right? You talk about how you understand the Brics.
Wonderful.
Oh, can you identify yourself too?
Yes. Paul, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Paul Meyer with the School for International Studies, and appreciate really rich presentations all around. I guess I have a very basic question. Is it likelihood of a parallel track of development between the Brics and the G7? The G7 starting off with essentially financial, economic focus, gradually extending that across a wide range of political type issues, including security issues. I was really struck by Eve's point about space and cyber getting new attraction. Sure, there's important economic dimensions of that, but also very significant security ones as well. So just get curious, Leslie, or your discussants, what you see, is that a likely trajectory for the Brics going forward? If they're here to stay, as you say.
Let's take a few more.
Go for a few more, okay. So we have Gerardo over here.
Yeah, I'm Gerardo Ortego, School for International Studies as well. I really found all the presentations really fascinating, and particularly the contrasting responses. They really are fairly contrasting. It seems like we have the state-centered kind of response and the market-centered entrepreneurial response. And it seems like in the state-centered response, maybe there's a little too much importance given, for instance, to the type of regime and whether we can actually define what type of regime we're talking about. In the call for this presentation, there was a clear distinction, like dichotomous distinction between authoritarian and democratic, but how clearly can those regimes be defined? Is the U.S. authoritarian, democratic? So it seems like Eric's presentation, in contrast to the state-focused, seemed almost a bit cynical from a market perspective. Like, what does outside mean? They're all inside the market, and they're just trying to make the best of it. That's more or less how I understood it. So I guess that's the question. about the state, or is it about the market? Does it make a difference to highlight the so-called regime differences?
So maybe I'll,
Go for it.
I'll take that. Paul, gee, are the Brics, I'm going to sit down, are the Brics likely to move beyond financial economic cooperation to not just, citizen to citizen, but in a way, things that matter? Maybe not defense, but cyber regulation and so on. I think a priori they have less in common than the G7. And one thing from the book that you've mentioned, and I didn't mention in my talk, is this idea of why are they together? Because they have common aversions. They all want to be more powerful vis-a-vis the advanced industrial countries. How long they will hang together is still an open question, including for me and my co-authors. And as I think both Yves and I brought up, the most conflictual relationship is between these two fast-growing neighbors who had a long border, and there have been 3 wars in the post-war period. And from the Indian standpoint, they see China as quite expansionist and quite dangerous. 3 wars that India has lost, I note. And the Indian commentators think that the incursion of the across the border line in the Deccan Plateau and so on was intentional, and they will say, see, it was just like this other president. So it looks different from India. I actually did have to laugh though when Eva was talking about how well the Chinese just got frustrated with how obstructionist the Indians were. I know they are perceived that way in many international organizations, and not just by China. That is true. So, I don't know. I think it depends on whether they see their interests continuing. For example, Brazil is probably less enthused about it now than it was before it had a change of government. Brazil was very enthused when it had 14 years of center-left governments, but now it has an extremely weak, but nonetheless hanging on, center-right government, which the new foreign minister under Temer, who's no longer the foreign minister, but at one of his first speech, he made no reference to the Brics, which would not have happened under Dilma or Lula, and he said, well, we want to be friends with we want to renew our relationship, strengthen our relationship with the US and Europe, and also other countries such as China and India, full stop. Didn't mention the Brics, just mentioned them as large power. So we'll see. I don't know. It will be interesting. Gerardo, state-centered approach versus market-centered. I agree with you. It's good to have people commenting who are going to give us a different one. I think the Brics themselves are pretty realistic, all 5 of them. I think their view of the organization tends to, despite all the let's have people-to-people diplomacy and blah blah, their view of the organization, particularly the big 3, which would be China, Russia, and India, are all pretty realist in how they see it. And partly because, they have this need to think of one another as security risks, sometimes partners, sometimes risks, whereas Brazil and South Africa have the luxury of not having to worry about China as an immediate neighbor, or Russia, or even India. So, and does regime type matter? Well, gosh, I think it does. I'm a political scientist and a bit of an economist and neurosociologist, so.
And is the U.S. authoritarian, or?
No.
Isn't it a
Do
plutocracy?
we have a terrible, well, maybe, partly, yes. I mean, that's closer, I don't think it's, I mean, it's still rule of law, you know. Yeah.
A quick thing is, so observing on the ground is the cyber things this year had a lot of legs. And it's in part because they all perceive the threat from the US. So again, it's a reaction. Since we have, especially now with the latest move on internet neutrality, we have the US moving to try to keep its monopoly over governance, that then give the common aversion, and they all have this common fear of being penetrated, dominated, etc. by the US at a time when most of them are moving to internet plus, etc., etc. I mean, I was in Beijing this morning, and doing a little opinion poll. I don't know how many of you realize if you do an opinion poll in Starbucks or in 7-Eleven in Beijing of how much of the payment is cashless by WeChat and Alipay, 90%. So China and then India is following close behind between the e-payments and the e-commerce. They're moving to complete dependence on the internet. And so they have a common sovereign interest in pushing against US dominance.
Yes, and one thing that's interesting is that particularly in the United States, maybe less so in Canada, the whole internet, cyber space, you know, all of this kind of issue arena is, the discourse is all about, oh, China's and Russia are censoring. And in Brazil, which doesn't censor, nonetheless they're on the Brics side for the reason you just said, because they see huge market power and being closed out of markets by large American firms with the government increasingly behind them.
And the whole Snowden background.
And what?
Snowden.
Snowden.
Behind it, that is.
Yeah.
The
That's the hypocrisy issue.
Right, that's right.
Let's take one more round of questions in the back.
Yeah, Frank Long at MIT from the business school. Very interesting discussion, but I'm curious about a more sort of a topical question arising from Xiamen, the BRICS summit. I wonder whether you can say the emphasis being placed on state versus market, whether there's some significant change in terms of the weight that's put on state versus market coming out from the BRICS summit. And maybe the answer is that there's no change. You know, it's the weight has been all along like that, or you might want to say state play a more important role in shaping out BRICS in the future, or the market is going to play more increasing role, or maybe it's an irrelevant question. But I think within the business school paradigm, the role of the state and the market is quite crucial. So I'm curious about your thought on that through your observation in terms of how the discussion in Xiamen summit, whether we can say anything conclusive.
Okay, other questions? From students especially? I encourage you.
Yeah, okay, so first I just want to quickly reply to your comment on how West worry about China's internet censorship. It's like I think the strategist guy in the White House, Steve Bannon, he also made a statement in Japan in December last year saying that, okay, like many of us in the West were being fooled. For example, on the 19th Congress, like the US media didn't really focus on President Xi Jinping's report, but instead they were focusing on the 91-year-old official. Like how many times also, I just want to say that I'm neither a economist nor a big strategy person, but one of my friends in China, he often talks about this kind of the big strategy issue. I haven't read your book yet, but I think probably you focus too much on the economy side. Like one of my friends said, China probably has bigger aim. You can say he is kind of a nationalist, but he is saying that China is trying to kind of weaken the U.S. dollar, which is the foundation, like one of the foundation of the U.S. hegemony. And he's saying that, for example, China is now the only country that can produce all those kind of things, from the high technology to like the everyday life. And for example, the high-speed railway, the economic plane, or like all those kind of things. So what he's trying to argue is, if the One Belt and One Road succeed and then export all those kind of things, so China really has a potential to let other countries to use the RMB instead of the US dollar. Because the US right now, although we can say the US has the hegemony in the field of economy, but only in terms of finance is very weak, because you don't really produce a lot of things. And the value of your money really depends on what you can produce. So this is kind of the larger picture he was trying to argue. So I just want to let you comment on this.
Do you want to take one more?
Great, let's take, you can have the last question.
Can I make a comment? Disguise it as a
That's-
No, I'll just say-
It could be very long, she's busy, and watch out.
No, I'm a Brazilian, but I was the first here to run, so I get credit for that. Yeah, no, by the way, I mean, it's just on the foreign shopping, I was remembering that Brazil is now, has officially pledged, well, given it's shown its official interest to join the OECD. So that also changes kind of this. I think my major comment has to do with the basic thing that you're talking about, the initial, about Brics. You know, does it matter? Does it really exist? And the impression that I always have is that if the countries involved think it matters, it matters. And I mean, is it weird? Yes. But also I imagine if you were to go back to 1973, 74, when the G7 was created, it was also a bit weird. I mean, why have Canada? Why Italy? But if those involved wanted to make something happen out of it and it sticks, then it sticks. And I keep thinking, if we were to look at when OPEC was created in 1960, if we were, you know, with Venezuela and Iran, Iraq, it was just a smorgasbord of weird countries that just happened to have oil. But right in 1960, it was weird. The G7, in a way, when it was created, it was probably weird. Most institutions, when they were created, I mean, now, after all this time, it's normal. So I just keep thinking, if the Brics kind of suffers from our very short attention span, and that we need to know minute by minute everything that's happening, because we only know about G7, I mean, we as scholars or people interested, by the little nuggets that came in the media once in a while. So in a way, I do think that the Brics have it a little bit more unfair because of the hyper scrutiny that we put on it, that most institutions that have been around for the last, you know, a couple of decades, they have the luxury of, you know, time ran slower for them. I like the Brics. So that's my mini rant on, yes, I'm eager to read the book.
Your question, just kidding. Okay, so last question, but keep it brief, and then we'll.
Okay, well, okay, just two quick things. One thing is the question about international institutions or organizations and the extent to which whether they're influential or whether they last and so on depends upon having a shared fundamental vision of what a good society is. And if that is an important component to international institutions or organizations having influence. And then the second question is, when I read the news and I read about the Brics, I usually read about China's economy, and it seems to be a fairly unstable situation at the moment. doesn't seem like a financially very well-organized setup in terms of their housing situation and so on. And so I'm curious, what would happen to Brics should that unravel in disorderly fashion?
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna let Yves take the one about the recent summit in China, okay? But, and I just lost a note, I think there was one in between and I can't quite recall, but anyway, I've forgotten the second, what was the second one? That's the second, oh, it was more like a comment, yes. Actually, I agree that if we just look at finance, the US looks a lot more powerful vis-a-vis China than if we look at the whole economy. I mean, after all, China's growing at this enormous rate and has managed, what is it, 9% growth for more than 30 years. That's extraordinary. And the United States lost its trade surplus in 1971. It's lost its current account surplus a decade later. And by the early 90s, it doesn't even have a surplus in terms of its global investments. So yeah, if you look at the overall economy, China has a lot of strengths that are not simply in finance. So finance, in a way, then you could argue, though, in terms of research design, is therefore a hard case. And you said many other interesting things, but I'll leave it at that. Deborah, well, okay. You made a nice, strong statement that actually I'm going to disagree with. The Brics matter if the Brics think they matter. Okay, they matter to themselves if they think they matter, but I think our question was actually, do they matter for international politics? Or maybe international economics or global governance of the financial system? And for that, it isn't enough if the Brics think they matter. We have to show that somehow they made a difference in what was going to be happening in the international system. We think that they did. So we think that they matter on that harder test as well. And the last question about whether international organizations need to have a shared vision of what a good society is. Well, as we've said in various ways, various of us, sometimes your vision is we all have a common enemy. If not a common enemy, I mean, common enemy will do wonders, right? Who were the allies in the Second World War? But if not a common enemy, at least a common group that we'd like to gain power vis-a-vis. And so long as each one of the Brics separately, particularly the larger four, sees that somehow they're not getting their share in global governance institutions, and that they could get more if they were willing to cooperate to push together, yeah, they'll hang together. Maybe all this institutionalization that Yves very nicely laid out for us, and then Eric built on, may make more enduring ties, as happened in Western Europe. Although, as kind of a statist myself, I think if high-level state interests break apart, a lot of those people-to-people business networks are going to end up breaking apart too. But that's my opinion. Do you guys want to have fun with it?
The Iranian Revolution brought together partners of convenience. And then after they overthrew the Shah, you had the bourgeoisie in bed with the Ayatollah. And then the next conflict is how to separate those two groups together. So, going to Leslie's question, how long will the Brics last? And what can we do if this partnership is not based on a shared value? Maybe that's what explains the longevity of, we can call 70 years a long time, of the Western world order.
Sure.
It could be that it's Wilsonian or values-based. Might be the seeds of conflict, if they were ever to succeed and recalibrate all the global
So I have a couple points. I want to combine the state and market question with the internet question. And the big point, I think, about the BRICS is that they reveal the shortcomings or the gaps or the hypocrisy where they exist in the liberal international order. So where there are such gaps, then there is that space for the BRICS. And in fact, you can see when you go to summits and all this, there's a lot of feeling of grievances, right? So that common aversion, that feeling of grievance, because in a way they have come to believe in the liberal international order, but where particularly the US, but not just the US being the dominant player here, comes short. For example, blacks quota reforms to the IMF that are completely basic, that you have China that still has 3% of voting rights and 50% global GDP. To anyone who wants to defend the global order, it's kind of obvious that you have to bring them up, right? And so in the US, it's crass enough to block that, then they feel all that grievance, right? So they reveal those kind of shortcomings where we profess a set of rules and we don't live by them. And it comes down to the two weakest areas. There's actually three, is finance, energy, and internet. And essentially those three domains are oligopolistic models with cartelized markets. So if we believed in markets, we would actually do what the US did 100 years ago with oil and break cartels. And, but where you have cartel, you cannot have a well-functioning global market. You have a cartel. So in finance, you have a complete cartel with Wall Street and the Citi, doing 85% global finance in a very, very concentrated oligopolistic way, where everybody else is a follower and has to be a rule taker even, and it has to be a crisis taker in 2008, right? And so that creates huge frustration for everyone else. And in fact, the same frustration that the BRICS had in 2008 was felt deeply by the French or the Germans or the Japanese. But the Japanese will never cross the Rubicon of working with China for other reasons. But they felt it. You go to the Ministry of Finance in Japan, they would say that the Chinese are right here, but we won't cooperate. The French are more easy. They would say they're right and will cooperate. They have had that frustration with the dollar since the 60s. We all know that. So there was a meeting of the minds, right? And my bias is I come from France, so I've grown in that environment. When it comes to the internet, let's not be fools here. 4 companies now monopolize the entire global data resource, and data has become this massive resource for everything, for AI, for global data, for etc. And they control, therefore, also privacy, right? Google and the 4 big ones, Facebook, etc. And so, well, you can be the Europeans and say, we see this, the French particularly see it and hate it, but don't have any way to stop it. The European Commission starts to step in, right, and do all this anti-cartel action against Google, in particular, but they will take all the 4. The Chinese saw it from a long time, from a long distance. This is not what the liberal international order should be. That's not what the rules say. 4 companies going to dominate everybody. So they were pretty crass too. They blocked them, all 4, based on security reasons, which then gave them the space to create alternative giants. So you have Alibaba, you have Tencent, and so today the only set of giants are Alibaba and Tencent on one hand, that control the entire data of the Chinese market and beyond, and the 4 big Americans that control our life in Canada and the European life and the Japanese, etc. But they control the data, and the security system of the US has access to it, right? We know from Snowden. The Chinese knew it, but the Chinese actions just reveals the cartel and the oligopolistic structure of the market. There's similar, a former PhD student at UBC, Pascal Massot, who is now a professor in Ottawa, did similar work in resource markets, energy markets and the like. And she saw that, for example, in iron was not a free market, was a cartelized market with 3 large companies setting the price in a very cartelized way, and it was controlled by particularly Japan. Japan had set up the cartel, and the Chinese becoming the biggest buyers were frustrated by that. We're kind of forcing that to behave in a cartel that was not dominated by them. And in fact, the Chinese pushed for deregulation and for breaking the cartel and having spot markets. So ironically, it's the Chinese action that revealed that we had not well-functioning market, a cartelized oligopolistic market. So that's the research from Pascal. So you find it across the board that often the Brics actions reveals first the failure in our well-functioning liberal order, which we then take for granted. We don't see them until something like this happens. And so my conclusion on this is you have on the state and market, I'm very close to EHCAR, right? Which is realism. And we often assume that there is no more state, that we just have a market, because we don't see anymore the architecture of institutions and power that's behind it. But when you have a new entrant that's bumping into an oligopolistic structure or a power structure, they see it, they feel it. Then they build an alternative. Then through their action, we see power and state. But that only serves to reveal that there was a forgotten power and state structure in the first place. And so there's a lot of that with the Brics, right? And so yes, therefore there's a lot of state. Because they're very realist about, they feel that EHCAR kind of power structure that's not sympathetic to them. So the internet battle is a massive one. But through security, through blocking, thanks to security, using security excuses in a way, they have isolated their market long enough to build giants, like nobody has been able to do. And that's pretty interesting. On
Security excuses, huh? That's interesting.
yeah, I mean, in some ways, well, it's true that they are super scared for some reason that they're going to lose power. But in fact, the government is very strong, very legitimate. There's high support by the middle class. They seem to feel more insecure than they really are. And then it becomes very strange. Why are they so hyperactive about all these controls, right? So the propaganda system does want to do it, but it has ironically become a tool to build like an infant industry protection that the Japanese did before. If you do political economy analysis, they have now the only cyber architecture that's able to rival the US system, right? And we forget, we in Canada, we're so innocent about all this, we forget that, when you write a WhatsApp message, the US security can read it. When you write a WeChat message, the Chinese security can read it. So whichever app you use, well, it's never the Canadian, and you actually give your identity to whoever wants to read it, but you choose where you put it. And we don't have the choice not to give it. You give it one or the other. We forget all that, right? There's all this behind the data that we give. On the joint, on whether they need a common dream or a common, Josh put it, a vision of a good society. So I really agree with Leslie that it's really, they don't have that, but they see, it's an EHCAR kind of set of grievances where they find lots of hypocrisy in the system. They feel it's dangerous to them, and then that brings them together, and again and again. So if we actually finish to build a liberal international that's fully rule-based, and we actually are pretty fair in giving the right voices, the right quota, in a way that the G20 did, and that's why China was so happy with the G20 or India, then the Brics will become less relevant and kind of fade away. But the more there's a gap between our discourse and our actual practices, particularly the US, then the more the Brics will kind of come together. It's an action-reaction. On China's instability, watch out because the media here covers about 1% of Chinese reality. Just remember that's about it. So yes, there is vulnerability in housing and finance, but they're not even as bad as they were in the US in the early 2000s or 1990s. And they are side by side with a lot of other strengths. That is, there's a lot of inner momentum in the economy that's purely domestic. The dependence on global exports going down. Going down from a peak of 40% down to by 20. The total trade over GDP is going down. And there is incredible momentum from grassroots, consumption development, services development, this explosion of e-commerce, etc., e-tourism. There's a lot of other components in that economy that makes the external analysts getting wrong again and again. We've predicted this collapse for 25 years, right? And we keep getting it wrong. Now the vulnerabilities still exist, but they are embedded within a set of other components that are strong, and also they have enormous levers of control still. So the capacity to react keeps surprising us. because we tend to see the vulnerabilities. We don't anticipate the enormous amount of actions that they might be taking at time t+1. And so we keep modeling that wrong. But one day something could still happen, but the coverage, I mean, the thing to remember is the coverage, particularly in Canada, even worse than the US, but is extremely limited on China, and it's not representative even.
Okay. Thank you very much. Did you want to say something, Leslie? Sorry.
No. Or Eric? No.
Shall we, we're a bit over time, so I'll just,
Yeah, I think we
I'm
should
bringing
just.
to a close, but I'm sure that, thank you to our two fine discussants
Yes,
and
thank you
to
so much,
Leslie for
guys.
your presentation. And